Whispers of history.
The air in Louisiana, heavy with summer heat, carries with it a kind of weight that seems to sink into the soil itself. By 1825, the great plantations along the Mississippi River had become emblems of both wealth and suffering, where the glittering world of white columned houses existed side by side with the endless toil of enslaved labor. It was within this strange duality, beauty masking brutality, that one of the region's most unsettling stories took root. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a wedding that promised to bind two powerful families together, sealed with music, fine food, and the promise of prosperity. Instead, it would become one of those rare tales that turned whispers into legends, a night remembered not for vows exchanged but for blood spilled on polished floors. At the center of it all stood Marianne Duval, the young bride whose name still flickers through local folklore. She was barely 20, a woman of striking poise, said to have skin like porcelain against the torchlight, and eyes that carried both sorrow and steel. Her groom, Charles Beaumont, came from one of Louisiana's wealthiest plantation dynasties, a family whose sugar empire stretched across acres of fields and dozens of lives bent under forced labor. Their union promised power, prestige, and the cementing of two dynasties. Neighbors spoke of the lavish preparations with awe. The house was adorned with magnolia blossoms and Spanish moss, chandeliers draped with candles, and tables groaning under imported delicacies. Guests arrived in carriages, their laughter spilling out into the humid night, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to notice, the tension that rippled beneath the veneer of celebration. For the enslaved workers forced to prepare the feast, polish the silver, and string the flowers, the event was yet another display of wealth extracted from their endless suffering. Still, even among the guests of honor, there lingered unease. Rumors had followed Marianne for months, that her heart was not truly bound to Charles, that her soul resisted the path chosen for her, that she whispered confessions to the servants in hushed tones when she thought no one else could hear. It was in this atmosphere of celebration laced with dread that the wedding began. The music played, the bride's veil shimmered, and vows were spoken beneath the gilded arches of the plantation's grand hall. Yet observers later said they could see the stiffness in Marianne's shoulders, the way her smile faltered when Charles placed the ring upon her finger. To the wealthy families gathered, it might have seemed nothing more than nerves. But to those who knew her more closely, it was a warning, a sign that this union was not a blessing, but a cage. As the night deepened, so too did the shadows. Laughter gave way to whispers, glasses spilled, and something in the air seemed to shift, an energy neither festive nor joyous, but restless. Accounts differ on what happened first. Some say it was a sudden scream from the kitchens, a clash of metal that silenced the music. Others insist that the violence began in the ballroom itself, amid the whirling of dancers and the clinking of crystal. But all agree on what followed: chaos, blood, and the irreversible shattering of a family's legacy. When the first blow fell, whether by knife, pistol, or bare hand, the fine garments and polished silver became witnesses to something darker. The night unraveled in a storm of violence that no guest could have imagined. Some whispered that it was Marianne herself who struck the first fatal act, her defiance breaking loose in one desperate moment. Others claimed it was Charles, whose temper had been infamous long before his marriage. Still others believe it was neither, that the violence came from outside, from those who had labored in silence too long, seizing the wedding as the moment to make their fury known. The truth, even now, remains obscured by layers of rumor and retelling. What is certain is that the grand plantation wedding, meant to symbolize unity, collapsed into carnage. The candles flickered against blood-stained gowns, the music fell silent, and the echoes of screams carried out into the swampy night air. By morning, the plantation was no longer a place of celebration, but a crime scene shrouded in secrecy. For years afterward, the story of Marianne's wedding traveled across Louisiana, changing in detail but never in tone. Some swore they saw her wandering the plantation halls long after her death, a pale figure clutching her veil in hands still wet with blood. Others believed the land itself absorbed the violence, cursing anyone who dared to build upon it again. What began as a single night of horror grew into a legend, whispered in New Orleans taverns and carried across the bayous like a warning. To tell this story now is to peel back the fragile layer of romance often draped over plantation history. Beneath the lace, the magnolias, and the chandeliers, there was always blood. Blood from the fields, blood from the homes, and, on that night in 1825, blood spilled in a ballroom where vows had barely been spoken. The wedding that should have united two families instead divided history into before and after, a moment where beauty gave way to terror, and where one bride's fate became inseparable from the shadows of Louisiana's haunted past. To understand the weight of what happened on that plantation night in 1825, we must first step back and look closely at the world that produced it. Louisiana in the early 19th century was a place of contrasts, lavish and brutal, refined and lawless, deeply Catholic yet bound to superstition. European in elegance but African and Caribbean in its heartbeat. It was a cultural crossroads unlike anywhere else in the United States. And in this mixture of wealth and suffering, a wedding was never just a private affair. It was a performance of power, a public declaration of who belonged and who did not. The Louisiana of the 1820s was still young in its American identity. Only 2 decades had passed since the Louisiana Purchase, when vast French and Spanish territories were sold to the United States. This meant that the region was still layered with traditions foreign to the Anglo-American South. French Creole families, Spanish administrators, African-descended communities, free people of color, and native tribes all shaped the culture of the Mississippi River parishes. At the top of the social pyramid stood the wealthy Creole and American planters, men who owned sprawling estates along the river's fertile banks. Their wealth came from sugar, a crop so demanding it was often referred to as a white gold, where the crop that consumed both the land and the lives of the enslaved workers forced to cultivate it. Plantation society in Louisiana was sharply hierarchical. For white elites, a wedding was as much about economics and alliances as it was about affection. Marriages cemented landholdings, secured dowries, and consolidated power. To marry into a family like the Beaumonts, who owned thousands of acres, was not just to secure one's future, but to ensure a family's survival in a competitive and often ruthless society. For women like Marianne Duval, her personal desires were secondary to her role as a vessel for family continuity. Her beauty, her education, her mannerisms, all of these were assets measured against the wealth she could bring through marriage. Yet beneath the polished surface of Creole ballrooms and French lace gowns, there was the other Louisiana. For every glittering chandelier, there were hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children laboring in brutal heat. The sugar industry was notorious even among slaveholding societies for its cruelty. The crop demanded constant attention. Cutting cane, feeding boilers, refining sugar, and the conditions destroyed bodies at alarming rates. The average lifespan of an enslaved worker in Louisiana's sugar fields was shockingly short. This reality infused the wealth of the Beaumonts and the Duvals with an unspoken truth. Every yard of silk at the wedding, every piece of silver polished to perfection, was paid for with human suffering. The social life of Louisiana in this era was also marked by the mingling of cultures, which produced both vibrant traditions and simmering tensions. Catholicism dominated religious life, but layered upon it were African spiritual practices, Caribbean rituals, and native beliefs. Folklore of spirits, curses, and restless dead thrived in the swamps and bayous, whispered by enslaved workers and carried into the minds of their masters. Weddings, especially those held on plantations, were thick with symbolic gestures meant to protect against misfortune. Candles burned to ward away shadows, bells rang to drive off evil spirits, and charms were sometimes hidden in gowns or food. It was a society where the supernatural and the social intertwined seamlessly, where even the most rational elites might lower their voice when speaking of omens. In the 1820s, Louisiana was also plagued by instability. The memory of slave uprisings still haunted planters. Just 14 years earlier, in 1811, the largest slave revolt in American history had erupted along the German coast near New Orleans. Hundreds of enslaved men and women had risen with crude weapons, marching toward the city in hopes of freedom. Though the rebellion was crushed, its memory lingered as a constant fear in the minds of plantation families. The mere possibility of revolt turned even joyous gatherings into moments of unease. When large groups assembled, as they did at weddings, there was always the silent awareness that those who served the feast outnumbered those who consumed it. The cultural tensions extended beyond the plantation fields. New Orleans, the closest city of influence, was a world of masked balls, gambling halls, dueling grounds, and marketplaces filled with goods from around the globe. It was a place where French aristocrats rubbed shoulders with free black artisans, where Spanish traditions lingered in architecture and law, and where American merchants were rapidly asserting their presence. The city was cosmopolitan yet dangerous, with crime, disease, and political intrigue woven into its very fabric. To host a wedding in this society was to declare one's rank, to demonstrate wealth and refinement, but also to expose one's family to the eyes of both friends and rivals. Marriages themselves were steeped in rituals meant to display endurance and unity. The grand halls of plantation homes, with their white columns and long verandas, served as stages for these ceremonies. Guests might travel for miles, arriving in carriages that kicked up dust along the river roads. Women wore silk gowns imported from France, their hair adorned with jewels or feathers. Men dressed in tailored suits, often with gold watches or canes that declared their status. Music, often played by enslaved musicians, filled the air with European waltzes or Creole dances. Food was abundant: roasted meats, imported wines, sugared fruits, all prepared by those who would never taste them. But while the guests celebrated, the enslaved staff moved silently behind the scenes, carrying trays, tending fires, and cleaning spills. For them, weddings were double-edged events. On one hand, the celebrations might provide rare scraps of food, a glimpse of music, or fleeting moments of joy. On the other, they were also times of heightened surveillance, when every movement was watched, and any misstep could mean punishment. This imbalance of joy and dread, of laughter above stairs and silence below, defined the plantation world. Into this social order stepped Marianne Duval and Charles Beaumont. Their wedding was not only a union of two young people, but also a union of two estates, two family legacies, two spheres of influence. For the guests, it was a night to dress in finery, to toast to prosperity, and to forget, for a moment, the heat of the cane fields or the whispers of rebellion. Yet for the bride, the meaning was more complex. She embodied the expectations of her family, the ambitions of her groom, and the traditions of her culture. Whatever private fears or hesitations she carried were not hers alone. They were silenced beneath the weight of history itself. It is against this backdrop of power and fragility, of wealth built on blood and faith interlaced with fear, that the events of that wedding night unfolded. To the outside observer, it was another grand Louisiana celebration. To those within, it was a night where every tension, economic, cultural, spiritual, seemed to gather beneath the flickering light of chandeliers, waiting for the moment when one thread would snap and unravel everything. The story of the plantation wedding that ended in blood cannot be told without this history. It is not only a tale of a bride and groom, but of a society teetering on the edge of change, where old traditions collided with new realities, and where beneath the polished surface of joy lurked the ever-present possibility of horror. The night of the wedding began like so many others across the Louisiana plantations of the 1820s. Candlelight flickered on polished silver. Musicians played their reels and waltzes, and guests toasted with imported wine. But what followed would never be mistaken for any other night. The layers of wealth and ritual gave way to something raw, violent, and unforgettable, an unraveling that could not be hidden behind lace or silks. What began as music ended as silence, punctuated only by screams and the iron scent of blood. Some guests later claimed the first disturbance was not a scream or a shot, but a faint sound from outside the ballroom. A crash, perhaps, or the clatter of something dropped in the kitchens. At first it was dismissed. The servants often worked under impossible pressure, and noise was part of their world. But Marianne, standing in her new husband's shadow, flinched at the sound. She turned her head sharply as though hearing something no one else could. That moment would linger in memory, a small tremor before the ground gave way. The Beaumonts and the Duvals had wealth, but they also carried grudges. Old debts, whispers of betrayal, rivalries buried beneath handshakes. Weddings brought these resentments into the open. Guests recalled sharp looks exchanged between uncles, the quick temper of Charles when wine spilled on his shoes, the hushed argument that seemed to pass between him and Marianne when they thought no one noticed. These were not the makings of tragedy by themselves, but in the tense air of Louisiana, where honor often ended in duels and tempers snapped like dry cane. They were sparks waiting for tinder. Later that night, a sudden crash echoed from the servants' quarters. A boy had slipped carrying a tray of knives to the table, an accident perhaps, or something more deliberate. The knives clattered loudly, their edges glinting in the torchlight as they slid across the floor. One guest laughed nervously, remarking that steel had no place at a wedding feast. But others fell silent, unsettled. In a society haunted by the memory of uprisings, the sight of weapons, even accidental, was enough to stir unease. Accounts diverged sharply on what happened next. Some say a guest stumbled on the knives and cut himself, a minor injury that nonetheless sent whispers racing through the hall. Others insist the first wound came later, when Charles, in a drunken rage, raised his voice to Marianne and struck her across the face, drawing a thin line of red against her cheek. Still others believe the first blood belonged to a servant, punished cruelly in the kitchen where no white eyes lingered long enough to witness. However it began, the scent of blood was undeniable, and once it entered the hall, the night shifted. The music swelled again, as though to cover the unease, but it did not last. In the midst of a waltz, a woman screamed, not from joy, but from horror. A man collapsed on the floor, blood seeping through his waistcoat. Some swore it was a duel that had broken out between two jealous cousins. Others whispered of poison slipped into a glass. The truth is lost, but the effect was the same. The guests scattered, skirts rustling, shoes sliding against the polished wood, panic spreading faster than fire. Amid the chaos, someone produced a knife. Whether it came from the kitchen, the table, or a pocket, no one could later say. What is remembered is the glint of steel under candlelight, the scream that followed, and the body that fell. The knife moved quickly, too quickly for the drunken guests to understand, and in moments the air was heavy with the cries of the wounded. Marianne's veil was torn in the panic. Her white dress stained red as she clutched the edge of a table for balance. At the same time, in the back halls, a lamp was overturned, accidentally or deliberately, no one could ever determine. Flames licked up the wooden wall, sending servants racing with buckets. Smoke curled into the ballroom, mingling with the smell of blood. Guests coughed, their fine clothes brushing against soot as they pushed toward the doors. But the doors were crowded, bottlenecked with carriages waiting outside, and in the chaos more were trampled than escaped. When the night ended, the greatest mystery remained. What became of Marianne? Some swore she was seen fleeing into the swamp, her dress trailing mud, her veil discarded like shed skin. Others claimed she was among the dead, her body whisked away in secret to prevent scandal. And a few whispered darker tales, that she stood silent amid the carnage, her face pale, her hands steady, as though she had been waiting for this unraveling all along. By dawn, the plantation was unrecognizable. The grand hall reeked of smoke and blood, its floorboards scarred, its windows blackened. The servants moved like ghosts, sweeping broken glass, carrying bodies, saying nothing. The guests, those who survived, vanished quickly, their carriages rolling away in silence, determined never to speak of what had happened. Yet they could not bury the story. Whispers spread to the towns, to New Orleans, across the river. And soon the tale of the wedding became something larger than life, a story not of celebration, but of blood, an event that blurred the line between history and folklore. And so the incidents piled one upon another. A fall in the kitchen, a cut upon the cheek, a body on the ballroom floor, a knife flashing, a lamp overturned, a bride vanished. Each detail disputed, each witness unreliable, and yet the whole unmistakable. The plantation wedding of 1825, meant to be remembered for its grandeur, instead lived on as a legend of horror. A night when all the forces of Louisiana's haunted soil, its grudges, its violence, its shadows, converged in a single storm of blood. When the last traces of smoke drifted over the cane fields and the blood was scrubbed from the wooden floors, the community of St. Landry Parish was left with questions that refused to fade. The morning after the wedding, silence hung over the plantation like a shroud. Those who had been present hurried back to their estates or townhouses, clutching their children, avoiding eye contact, speaking only in whispers. The story, however, could not be contained within the walls of the Duval plantation. It slipped out through the mouths of servants, coachmen, and musicians, and by the week's end, the tragedy had spread across Louisiana. transformed into rumor, legend, and cautionary tale. Neighbors were the first to respond, their reactions shaped by proximity and fear. For some, the violence confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Beaumont and Duval families were cursed by greed and old grudges, and that no marriage could mend the fractures between them. For others, the bloodshed was a sign of divine punishment, proof that arrogance and excess invited ruin. Neighbors avoided traveling near the plantation at night, and some refused altogether to cross the narrow dirt roads that led to the once grand estate. The clergy weighed in quickly. A local pastor, called upon to bless the bodies before burial, delivered a sermon that shook the small church to its rafters. He spoke of pride, of the dangers of vanity, and of sins festering beneath silk and lace. The congregation nodded solemnly, but outside the church whispers continued. Did the pastor believe Mary Ann had been taken by God, or by something darker? Was she truly missing, or had she been hidden away to protect family honor? Parishioners lingered after services, exchanging fragments of hearsay, until the story grew stranger, more macabre, with every retelling. Doctors, too, tried to impose order upon the chaos. One physician who examined the bodies noted the variety of wounds: knife cuts, bruises from trampling, lungs filled with smoke. To him it was a tragic but explainable disaster, a collision of accidents and passions. Yet even he admitted that the sheer number of deaths at a single wedding defied precedent. Local medical journals did not publish his report. It was deemed too scandalous, too damaging to reputations. But his words circulated quietly among professionals, fueling private debates about hysteria, collective panic, and the limits of human behavior when pressed to its breaking point. The newspapers, however, could not resist. In New Orleans, the Times-Picayune ran a column that blended fact with sensationalism, calling the event the Wedding of Death. Some editions exaggerated the death toll. Others invented details outright. One article insisted that Mary Ann herself had wielded the knife, cutting down relatives in a fit of madness. Another claimed a slave uprising had begun during the feast, suppressed only by brutal force. Each account contradicted the next, yet the effect was the same. The plantation was branded with infamy, and its name carried a chill whenever spoken aloud. Psychological interpretations emerged in hushed tones. Scholars of the era, still bound by moral and religious frameworks, speculated about hysteria among women, the corrupting power of alcohol, or the possibility of race contagion, a disturbing pseudo-scientific notion that violence among enslaved communities could infect their owners like a fever. These theories revealed more about the prejudices of the age than the truth of the wedding, but they endured, feeding the myth. The violence became less an isolated tragedy and more a mirror of the society that produced it, hierarchical, anxious, and perpetually haunted by its own contradictions. Among the enslaved community, the story spread with a different rhythm. To them, the disaster was not shocking but expected. They had long seen how the masters lived in excess while punishing even the smallest mistakes among their laborers. The bloodshed was read as balance, a rare moment when fate cut through privilege. Some whispered that spirits of the dead, those who had suffered in the fields, the kitchens, and the whipping posts, had risen that night to collect their due. Around their fires, stories were told of ghostly figures seen slipping into the ballroom, their shadows merging with the smoke. These tales would endure far longer than the official accounts, shaping the plantation's reputation for generations. Families of the dead, desperate to preserve dignity, commissioned quiet burials. Headstones bore no mention of the wedding, no reference to the night of violence. In private, however, grief was tinged with suspicion. Relatives accused one another of hiding truths, of shifting blame. Inheritance disputes erupted, with lawyers quietly noting that the bloodshed had not only ended lives, but altered fortunes. The wealth of the Beaumonts and Duvals began to fracture. Estates sold off piece by piece as scandal made them untenable. There were those who tried to erase the memory altogether. Rooms of the plantation were repainted, the ballroom refurbished, its scorched beams replaced. For a time, the house opened again for smaller gatherings, but few would attend. Even when dressed in finery, the guests glanced nervously at the corners of the room, as if expecting the air to darken, the candles to flicker, the screams to begin again. Silence would eventually reclaim the house, and its shutters closed for good. Beyond the parish, the tale drifted into folklore. Travelers heard of the cursed wedding while passing through taverns. Some said the bride still roamed the cane fields, her dress torn and stained, her eyes hollow. Others swore the plantation itself groaned at night, its floorboards echoing with phantom footsteps. Whether one believed or not, the story carried weight. It was a warning, a parable, and a source of unease that no rational explanation could fully dismiss. By the 1830s, a decade after the tragedy, the Duval plantation was no longer spoken of as a place of wealth, but as a ruin, haunted by memory and rumor. The community, though eager to move on, could not fully let it go. The event remained in their sermons, their fireside stories, their unspoken fears. It was a reminder that beneath the polished veneer of Southern gentility lay something unstable, violent, and always threatening to resurface. What endured most strongly was not the facts, which had long since dissolved into contradiction, but the atmosphere. Those who passed near the plantation swore they felt the weight of silence pressing upon them, as though the land itself remembered. In the collective mind of the parish, the wedding was no longer a single night but a permanent scar, proof that beneath the rituals of wealth and tradition lurked a truth both terrifying and undeniable. No amount of ceremony could keep blood from surfacing when history itself demanded it. The night had already collapsed into a blur of chaos, bloodied clothes, overturned chairs, the stink of smoke, but the true climax of the wedding had not yet arrived. For every guest who tried to flee, there were others frozen in place, transfixed by the scene unraveling before them. It was as if time itself bent inside the ballroom, stretching each scream into eternity. Mary Ann stood at the center of it all, her white dress no longer a symbol of purity, but a canvas of red stains. Her veil had slipped from her hair, leaving her face bare to the flickering light of half-melted candles. Witnesses later disagreed on the expression she wore. Some swore she was in shock, her eyes wide, lips trembling. Others whispered that she looked calm, detached, as though the bloodshed around her was not tragedy but revelation. Charles, her husband, stumbled toward her. His waistcoat was torn and his breath reeked of wine. One hand clutched the edge of a table for support, the other reached for Mary Ann as though to reclaim what was slipping away. But before he could grasp her, another figure lurched into view. A cousin perhaps, or a rival. The man's face was slick with sweat, his eyes wild. In his hand was the knife. No one could say where the blade first struck. Some believed Charles was stabbed in the chest, his cry breaking the remaining spell of music. Others insisted the blade missed, cutting instead across Mary Ann's sleeve. What all accounts agreed upon was the sound, the unmistakable rip of cloth followed by the wet gasp of blood. Panic erupted once more. Guests shoved past each other in a frenzy to escape. Women tripped on their gowns, men pushed their way to the doors, and children were carried screaming under arms. Servants, caught in the rush, tried to direct people away from the smoke, but the crowd paid no heed. In the chaos, candles toppled, igniting tablecloths and curtains. The flames climbed higher, chasing the guests toward the exits, until the ballroom itself seemed to burn alive. Through the haze, Mary Ann's voice rang out, not a scream, but something quieter, steadier. Some remembered her calling Charles's name. Others swore she whispered a prayer or a curse. Whatever the words, they seemed to root her in place while others fled. She did not run. She did not cover her face from the smoke. She simply stood amid the rising fire, her figure a ghostly silhouette against the orange glow. Charles collapsed at her feet, blood pooling beneath him. The cousin, or rival, or stranger, was dragged away by a cluster of men, their shouts lost in the roar of the flames. The knife clattered to the ground, its blade streaked red. In that moment, Mary Ann bent, not to flee, but to touch the steel. Her fingers brushed the hilt and her white gloves absorbed the blood. Then the ceiling groaned. The fire had spread too far, weakening the beams. With a deafening crack, a section of timber crashed to the floor, sending sparks across the hall. Guests screamed anew, those still trapped inside, clawing at the windows, their fists pounding against glass. Horses outside reared in terror, carriages overturned, and the night spiraled into a cacophony of destruction. One witness, hiding behind a toppled table, swore they saw Mary Ann step over her fallen husband and walk deliberately into the flames. Another insisted she was dragged away by a servant, her body shielded from the fire. Still others believed she vanished entirely, leaving no trace. When rescuers searched the ruins the next day, her remains were never found. The climax was not only fire and blood, but silence. Once the screams had died, once the flames had eaten their fill, the plantation was reduced to a husk. The great hall, once proud and gilded, lay in ruin. Its chandeliers melted, its floorboards blackened, its windows shattered. Bodies lay scattered among the debris, some charred beyond recognition, others sprawled as though still dancing. The wedding feast had ended, not in celebration, but in carnage. Outside, under the cold moonlight, the survivors gathered. Their faces were pale, their fine clothes singed, their hands trembling. No one spoke at first. They stood in small clusters, eyes darting back to the smoking ruins. When words finally came, they were hushed, broken, riddled with disbelief. Some wept openly, others muttered prayers. A few simply stared, unable to accept that the night had ended this way. Among them, children clung to their mothers, asking where the bride had gone. None of the adults could answer. They had seen Marianne. Yes, she was there. But at the end, in the smoke and fire, she had slipped away like a wraith. Her absence became the final, unsolvable riddle of the night. In the days that followed, rumors multiplied. Some said she had perished in the flames, her body consumed until nothing remained. Others whispered she had fled into the swamp, her mind broken, her spirit forever wandering. And still others claimed she had never been human at all, that she was an omen, a phantom bride conjured by Louisiana's haunted soil, appearing only long enough to draw blood before vanishing into the dark. The climax of the wedding, then, was not a single moment, but a cascade of them, a knife flashing under candlelight, a body collapsing, a ceiling collapsing in fire, and a bride disappearing without a trace. Each detail contradicted the next, yet together they painted a picture of horror too powerful to forget. When the smoke finally cleared and the plantation stood in ruins, one truth remained undeniable. No one who had attended the wedding of 1825 would ever be the same. They had walked into a hall of music and laughter, and they had walked out into silence and ash. Between those two states lay the climax, a night of fire and blood that carved itself into memory, legend, and fear. And in that silence, the land itself seemed to whisper. The cane fields swayed under a heavy wind, their stalks rattling like bones. The river carried ashes downstream, scattering them into the bayou. The plantation house stood black against the horizon, its windows hollow, its halls echoing with ghosts. The climax had passed, but its echoes would not fade. For in Louisiana, history never dies. It lingers, restless, waiting to rise again. When the embers cooled and the ruins of the plantation were left in silence, Louisiana itself seemed to hold its breath. The land had absorbed the blood of a dozen lives. The smoke had carried grief across the cane fields, and the people who survived the wedding carried scars that no physician could mend. Yet what haunted them most was not the fire or the bodies. It was the absence of a single figure. The bride, Marianne, whose story had begun in silks and candlelight, was nowhere to be found. Some insisted her body had been reduced to ash, that the fire consumed her so completely that nothing remained to bury. Others whispered of a hasty cover-up, that her family, desperate to preserve honor, buried her secretly in the swamp, away from prying eyes. But the most unsettling tales came from those who swore they had seen her walking, long after the ruins had cooled. A woman in tattered white, drifting at the edge of the cane fields, her veil trailing like a shroud, her face pale as bone. The absence of certainty allowed the story to grow. It spread through the parish, carried in hushed voices at church gatherings and market stalls, until it became more than a tragedy. It became folklore. Children were warned not to wander near the ruined plantation, lest they encounter the ghostly bride. Travelers spoke of strange lights flickering among the trees at night, or the sound of faint music drifting on the wind. Some claimed that if you stood near the ruins on the anniversary of the wedding, you could hear the faint echo of a waltz, cut short by a scream. But the epilogue of this story is not only ghostly, it is cultural, social, and deeply human. The wedding's collapse revealed the fragility of the world it came from, a society built on wealth, pride, and the brutal exploitation of others. The violence at the plantation became a metaphor, whispered in the quarters of the enslaved. No matter how high the walls of the great house, no master could escape the reckoning of blood. For them, the bride's disappearance was not a mystery but a sign, a reminder that even those draped in lace and pearls could be swallowed by darkness. Years turned to decades, and the ruins of the Duval plantation slowly sank into the Louisiana soil. The fields grew wild, the cypress roots clawed at the foundations, and vines crept over what was left of the charred ballroom walls. By the time the Civil War came, the house was little more than a husk. Soldiers passed through, curious about the old stories, but few dared to spend the night under its broken roof. Even in ruin, it carried the weight of memory. In the years after emancipation, freed families avoided the land altogether. They said the soil was poisoned, not by fire or ash, but by something older. The wedding was only the final spark in a place already heavy with sorrow. Generations of toil, pain, and silence had seeped into the ground, and no crops planted there seemed to thrive again. The plantation was abandoned, left to rot beneath the sun and swamp air, a monument to something best left unspoken. And yet, the story refused to fade. By the late 19th century, it appeared in local papers again, this time as folklore retold for curious readers. Writers embellished the tale, painting Mary Ann as a spectral figure cursed to relive her wedding night, forever searching for her missing groom. Some gave her a knife, others a veil dripping with blood. The story shifted shape, but its heart remained. A wedding that ended not with vows fulfilled, but with fire, violence, and disappearance. Today, historians struggle to untangle fact from myth. Parish records confirm deaths at the plantation on the night of the wedding, but the details are sparse, and many documents have vanished. Diaries from neighboring families mention a fire, a panic, and the name Duval spoken with shame. But none offer certainty about Mary Ann's fate. Was she truly consumed by the flames? Did she run into the swamps, mad with grief and terror? Or was she transformed into something else entirely? An idea, a warning, a ghost that never rests? Perhaps the most chilling possibility is the simplest, that Mary Ann's story endures because it was never meant to be solved. The mystery itself became the power. The silence around her fate allowed each generation to project its own fears onto the tale. Fear of social ruin, fear of madness, fear of the inescapable violence woven into the South's history. In that sense, Mary Ann still walks among us, not as flesh, but as memory. Stand today in the cane fields where the plantation once stood, and you may feel it, the air thick, the ground soft beneath your feet, the silence too deep. Birds grow quiet and the wind seems to shift. Some claim to hear the faint rustle of silk or the low hum of a wedding tune cut short. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps the land remembers more faithfully than people ever could. And so the epilogue lingers, not with closure, but with questions. What happened to the bride of St. Landry Parish? Was she victim, survivor, or specter? Did the fire consume her? Or did history transform her into a legend so enduring that she can never truly die? We are left not with answers but with unease. The same unease that silenced the parish nearly 2 centuries ago. The plantation wedding of 1825 remains a scar on Louisiana's past. A story passed down not to explain but to remind. Beneath the rituals of wealth and joy, beneath the gilded chandeliers and white lace, something darker always waits, and sometimes it rises.